So in current policy and health provision, self-injury is pretty much always seen as a mental health problem. It's seen as something that relates to some flaw or difficulty inside the individual and the way that they are processing or the way their brain works. From my perspective, that's not necessarily the most useful way to look at it, and it also misses the fact that many of the experiences that are causing the distress that people end up self-injuring to deal with is nothing to do with the inside of their head. It's to do with social structures and inequalities and problems that exist outside the individual. So to continually respond to self-injury as if it's just a problem within the person themselves is almost doing another injustice to the person by saying, this is again something wrong with you, whereas I think it's much more helpful to think about what's wrong with what's happened to that person, what have they experienced that has caused them this pain, rather than to think it's just, like I say, a flaw within them. So again, common what we might think of as social factors that people often see as having a significant relationship to self-injury include things like sexual orientation. So there are very high rates of self-injury among, in particular, young lesbian, bisexual and gay people. And again, very much of this is related to the kind of stigma, bullying that still very much exists in society towards people who are not heterosexual. Gay is still used as a pejorative word in many contexts. And so this can create all kinds of problems, particularly for young people who might be nervous about coming out at school, or to their family who maybe themselves have perhaps conservative ideas and attitudes around sexuality. So people end up in this situation where they occupy a very stigmatised identity, they're afraid to speak about who they are, and again it becomes internalised in these kind of problematic ways. There's also quite high rates of self-injury among people who identify as transgendered, although there's much less research in this area. But what research exists shows that it's quite common for people who are undergoing a conflict, not only around their gender identity, but in terms of having that recognised and access to treatment. Again, self-injury can be one way that they try and manage, express that, and also to some extent punish themselves for what they're experiencing. We also know from research that there seems to be significantly high rates of self-injury among young women who are from Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups. And again, some of the research that's been done by organisations that support minority communities look at the particular conflicts and pressures that young women from those backgrounds might experience, and that includes things like racism as well as gendered expectations, and again that things like racism are targeted very often at an individual's body, at their physical characteristics. It can be very shaming, frightening, and can bring up anger, sense of powerlessness, and again all of those things are things that self-injury can be an outlet for. We also know there's very high rates of self-injury among people with intellectual disabilities. Historically, this was seen as part of the disability, so it was just seen as part of the impairment that people were living with. More recent research has really highlighted that actually self-injury among people with intellectual disabilities, it's no different from the rest of the population. Again, it speaks to all of those experiences like powerlessness, lack of control, experience of abuse and victimisation. And when we think that people with intellectual disabilities tend to have little or no control over where they live, what they do, what they wear, who they live with, their sexuality, and also that they're much more vulnerable to physical, emotional and sexual abuse than the non-disabled population. You can see very quickly why you might find higher rates of self-injury among people with intellectual disabilities. But again, it's nothing to do with the disability, it's all about the context in which they're placed. So one of the final areas around self-injury and social factors that's really important to recognise relates to social class. And historically there's been quite a strong perception or stereotype that self-injury most often occurs among young women from quite privileged backgrounds. So it tends to be something in sort of middle class white teenage girls. And again, this is something that really a lot of the broader research would really challenge, in that very often the experiences of social and economic disadvantage create a lot of the stresses that are going to relate to self-injury. So when people are living in poverty, surrounded by violence, where people don't have access to the kind of basic material resources that they need, or have really poor education, so are really internally frustrated and are coping with huge amounts of stresses both within their immediate life and the context that they're in, it can be very significant. There also seems to be quite high rates of self-injury among people who are significantly disadvantaged, so who are homeless, for example, or living in very precarious contexts. So again, the idea of it sort of being something that just exists within a privileged group is really not reflected by the experience at all.